We've tried everything. There's nothing more that we can do. I heard those words, but between all of my organs shutting down and the unbearable pain, I didn't really know what my doctors meant until my family came into the room to say their final goodbyes, and a priest read me my last rites. I was 25 years old. 6 months earlier, I was a former college quarterback and a medical student trained to become an oncologist in memory of my mom when I became suddenly ill with Castleman disease, a rare and deadly illness where your immune system attacks and shuts down your vital organs for an unknown cause. And here I was, 6 months later, fighting to survive. In a last-ditch effort to save my life, my doctors gave me a combination of 7 chemotherapies. Somehow, I survived. But I would go on to relapse and nearly die 4 more times in the next 3 years. And I knew it was unlikely I could survive another one of those relapses. I knew my only chance and only hope would be to identify an existing drug that could be repurposed for me. I knew it was possible because many diseases share the same underlying mechanisms and can therefore be treated with the same drug. So I began performing experiments in the lab on my own blood samples. And from within the data emerged a drug, sirolimus. It had been around for decades, but had never been used for my disease. I began testing it on myself, and after nearly dying 5 times in 3 years, it's been over 9 years that I've been in remission on this drug. During this remission, I married the love of my life, Caitlin. We've had 2 beautiful children. I wrote a book about my journey chasing my cure, and I joined the faculty at the University of Pennsylvania to continue to chase more and more cures. We've already identified and advanced 13 more repurposed treatments for drugs that were not intended for those diseases. These are some of these patients that are alive today because of drugs that we repurposed for them. I want to highlight Michael's story in particular. Michael came to us back in 2016 with a diagnosis of metastatic angiosarcoma and was given a 3-month prognosis. We looked and scoured the world's knowledge of angiosarcoma, and we found out that 3 years prior, researchers had made a connection between PD-1 and angiosarcoma. Importantly, 3 years had now passed, and no one had yet tried a PD-1 inhibitor in these patients. So based on this, we performed an experiment on Michael's tumor and confirmed, in fact, there was increased PD-L1 expression, and we began Michael on PD-1 inhibitor as the first patient ever with angiosarcoma. It's been over 7 years now that Michael's been doing great on this drug that was literally hiding in plain sight, and now NCCN guidelines recommend PD-1 inhibition for angiosarcoma. And while we're so thankful for progress like this, it begs the question, how many drugs are sitting in your neighborhood CVS that could be a treatment for you or someone you love that we just don't know yet? And in many cases, there's already knowledge in the world that can link that drug to a new disease area. See, there are about 3,000 drugs that are FDA approved for about 3,000 human diseases, but there are an additional 9,000 human diseases that don't have a single FDA-approved therapy. Not a single approved therapy. That means that 1 in 10 of you, your children, and your grandchildren either has or will develop a disease without a single approved drug. And these children will not, 1 in 3 of these children will not survive until kindergarten. So as we look at these drugs and we recognize that it's both faster and less expensive to repurpose a drug for new indications, and in many cases there's already knowledge in the world connecting them, repurposed drugs like my own, cures like my own, sit on the pharmacy shelf for decades because of 3 systemic problems. First, there's no organization that's responsible for ensuring that drugs are used for every disease that they possibly can. Not the NIH, not the FDA, not pharma, no one. Second, there's no database that brings together data on all the treatments that could be used in every possible way. And third, there are insufficient incentives for companies to repurpose drugs, especially the 80+% of drugs that are already generic. So a few months ago, we launched EveryCure, a nonprofit organization to leverage the power of artificial intelligence and the world's knowledge to unlock the life-saving potential of each and every drug to treat each and every disease possible. So the way we do that is by first leveraging the world's knowledge from biomedical knowledge graphs that are publicly available and have been funded by the NIH. Second, we integrate in data from private companies like Eversana and Elsevier that have donated additional private data to us to better understand new uses for existing medicines. And third, we're engaging with pharmaceutical companies to understand, among the drugs that you developed that are now generic, what were the additional diseases you thought about but didn't pursue, or maybe you did pursue, but you never actually took that drug all the way forward to being used as an indication. We leverage all that information and apply a number of artificial intelligence approaches to actually come up with a single predictive score for every drug against every disease, how likely every drug is to be able to treat every disease. There are about 3,000 FDA-approved drugs, and there are about 12,000 human diseases, so it's a total of 36 million scores. You can imagine here a score of a 0.93 is a very high score on the top, 0.001%. We make all this data publicly available to the world to accelerate research and drug development worldwide, but we don't stop there. We utilize these scores to identify the areas that we want to look for further potential for these drugs. We do work in the lab and also clinically to validate these hits and then move them forward into clinical trials. Finally, as we do clinical trials and we demonstrate the drugs are effective in new uses, we work to make sure they can get to patients. So first, making sure that they're actually accessible and they're paid for by payers, but secondly, that patients and physicians are aware of these compounds or these now drugs and can use them in the new indication. And finally, in some cases, we work with the FDA to change the label, but that's not essential. Over 20% of all prescriptions today are written for drugs that are off-label, used in indications they're not actually approved for. We are so excited today to announce that we ran the first ever all versus all query, generating 36 million scores for every drug against every disease in partnership with collaborators at Penn State University, David Koslicki and Chung Yu Ma. We've generated these 36 million scores and begun to integrate and validate them further. Of course, given that Castleman's is an important area near and dear to our heart, we dug in deeply into Castleman disease, and we were really excited to see the results that we got back. In particular, the first hit, adalimumab, a TNF inhibitor that had never been used before for Castleman disease until just a few months ago when we treated the first patient ever with Castleman's with this TNF inhibitor. A patient named Al in Vancouver was treated and went from being literally preparing to go on hospice care for his Castleman disease to responding incredibly well to adalimumab. This is now just a first step with the first disease that we've looked at, but we are so excited that Al's doing so well and that we've been able to utilize this platform in this way. We've also begun to look at other diseases and drugs that this platform is predicting. We're really excited to think about drugs like bosutinib for ALS, folinic acid for autism spectrum disorder, and meroleptin for anorexia. But there's still a lot of work to be done. As we think about all drugs versus all diseases, and we think about repurposing in particular, repurposing approaches typically look for one disease area, let's say Castleman's or COVID, and all of the drugs that might be useful for you. You're looking for the lowest hanging fruit on that particular tree or that disease. But what we're doing with Every Cure is we're looking across the entire forest, every drug against every disease to figure out what is the lowest hanging fruit across the entire forest. And this statistically increases our likelihood tremendously that we're going to identify repurposed drugs that can save patients' lives right away. We are so thankful for the amazing partners that have already joined on board over the last 6 months, and we're eager to establish additional partnerships. We've made so much progress, but we have so much more work still to be done, and we need your help in 3 ways. First is with funding. We have built out this platform that has already demonstrated the value, but we need to integrate additional data, we need to validate our hits, and we need to bring in a team to drive forward these opportunities all the way forward to clinical trials. We're raising $9 million for work over the next 3 years to build out the team and the algorithm to get 15 drugs ready for clinical trials, which, just for perspective, that's less than 1% of what it costs to develop one drug from scratch, and our goal is to take 15 forward to clinical trials with that amount of funding. Secondly, we need to continue to engage with healthcare organizations to bring in new data sets so we can continue to improve the algorithm, and finally, to work directly with partner organizations to help us to launch clinical trials. I hope you all will join us on our mission to unlock every cure so that no patient is ever told we've tried everything when there's a life-saving cure on the pharmacy shelf. Thank you all so much.
David, wow, that was incredible. Thank you for sharing your journey and your story with us. To continue this conversation, please welcome to the stage Isabella Cueto, chronic disease reporter at STAT.
Hi, everybody.
Hi, Issa.
How you doing, David?
Doing well.
Thanks for that great introduction. There's so much to talk about, and I hope that the coffee is kicked in because I'm going to be coming to you all for lots of questions later. I want to start with a piece of big news, which is that big hit adalimumab for Castleman. Tell me about the moment when you received that news and what your reaction was.
Well, there were a few moments, and of course, from my journey chasing my cure, obviously there have been a lot of highs and lows, and as we've begun to chase cures for other patients, lots of highs and lows, and I would definitely say these are some of the biggest highs. We first identified this drug could be promising several years ago in the laboratory, and then it was March 29th of this year that it came up as the #1 hit. That actually also happens to be my birthday, so it was like the ultimate birthday gift to find out that this was the #1 hit, and also corresponded with learning that this drug was helping this patient, Al. And as I've gotten to learn more about Al's journey and to hear about what this meant for his daughter in particular, he was preparing for hospice care and had to already have that conversation with his family. And then this drug that was just sitting at the neighborhood CVS, just waiting to be used, meant that he has some more life, and he's not on hospice care, and his daughter, gets to spend more time with him. So it's incredible.
How old did you turn?
I turned 38.
38. And we just heard the story about when you were 25. You
That's
thought
right.
that was the end for you.
Yep.
How did it feel to receive that news and have it be a milestone in every cure's formation and creation?
Yeah, it just, everything feels like a dream. I mean, this feels like a dream right now. I'm sitting here with you, and my heart's beating, and I've got 2 beautiful kids on the other side of the country. Just feels like a total dream, and I'm convinced that I'm going to wake up and it's back when 13 years ago, and I'm on my deathbed, and none of this is real. But I think it's real. I don't know. You guys tell me. I think
It's
this is
not.
real
It's
life.
not. Simulation.
And it's all simulation. And because I'm in this time, I call it overtime. It's time I didn't think that I would have, where I've tried to make the most of every second. And it's while in overtime, time you didn't think you'd have, might as well take a really big swing at this really big systemic problem that drugs are not fully utilized, and that our healthcare system does an incredible job developing drugs for new uses, and then does a really lousy job making sure that they're utilized for every disease and every patient they can treat. And we've got to take it on. And I'm so thankful to have amazing partners like Grant Mitchell, co-founder of Every Cure, and Tracy Sikora, who we've made it our life's mission. I'm in overtime because of my disease, but so many other people have joined on board to take this on.
And you argue that every cure should exist because the systems that do exist aren't properly incentivized to repurpose generics. What makes you think that you can avoid some of those pitfalls that have prevented the repurposing of drugs up to this point?
I think the biggest one is just that there are no financial incentives for repurposing a generic drug. And as we said earlier, 80% of FDA-approved drugs are already generic. So 80% of the tools that can save you and your loved ones aren't being studied at all. And so it's a huge problem, but because there aren't clear financial incentives, we needed to be a nonprofit to do this, where we could say, well, we're just going to raise philanthropic dollars and government dollars to do the work that really is hard to be incentivized. So I think 1 is doing it as a nonprofit organization. I think 2, it's making sure we can work with the right people. I mean, there are people in this room and watching who are making decisions at pharmaceutical companies about how to pursue new uses for existing medicines and potentially sharing the data. This is the time. And if you're listening and you're in that position to be able to share information about potential uses for your drugs, please, please, please share those with us.
Yeah, when we were talking earlier this week, I was like, what would a pharma company ever share their data with you? And you made a pitch, basically. But I want to give some of you in the room a chance to comment. Would you do it? Would you not? Do you have questions for David?
We have a question over here from Catherine Ames.
Hi, David. Hi, Issa.
Hi,
I'm Catherine. I am a patient, and I am one of those patients who receives a medication off-label for a low-hanging fruit condition, which is POTS, and it's part of the POTS MCAS EDS trifecta. And that condition, those conditions specifically, there isn't any development for drugs for those conditions. They're conditions that are considered to be livable. They aren't as pressing or severe as something that is as life-threatening as what you experienced, but they severely deteriorate the quality of life of many young people and young women like me. So on the back of Issa's question about how do you incentivize the government, how do you incentivize Congress? Is this a policy issue, especially when you're considering taking low-hanging fruit drugs like Corlinor, which is used for heart failure, made by Amgen, and repurposing it for POTS, which for me has been an incredible uphill battle. Every year I have to get it reapproved, but it's a life-changing medicine for many POTS patients. So I'm just curious as a patient about how you, like Issa said, pitch that essentially, because we definitely feel forgotten about. But what you said, these medications are really easily accessible if we just make them accessible to more conditions.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I'm glad to hear that it sounds like the drug's working. The big problem is getting the system to get it to you. And so I think this sort of goes back to Issa's point around the system isn't really well positioned for a generic drug that doesn't have that disease on the label to necessarily get to you. So, the last step of that one slide where I showed the framework for how every cure works is working directly with payers and making sure they recognize the value proposition for where, why they should reimburse these drugs. Of course, this is work that's done by pharmaceutical companies when they get new indications, but in a case where the drug is generic and there is not going to be a new indication, someone's got to do it. And so we feel like we should lean into that. But we realize we can't do it on our own, so we need to work with amazing patient advocates like yourself and other organizations to really take these forward. So yeah, I think there really is a call to action here for groups that you're affiliated with, MECSF and others, that when there is a drug that looks promising and is already helping people, let's take care of that last checkbox, that last step of the process, and actually go directly to payers to make sure these things are reimbursed.
Issa, we have another question right here.
Thanks. Roy Orty from Stanford. Before where I am now, I was working for pharma companies and actually helping them with indication selection.
Nice.
And you're right that it's tricky, right? The company's about to take a big bet, so they're going to put down a lot of money, and they want to be sure that they're picking the right indication. And usually they pick one, use that as a foot in the door, and then expand outwards. But they can't cover everything.
Exactly.
So then we love the fact that someone like you is coming in and coming up with all these hits. My question is, I saw for Castleman's you had about 175 hits.
Well, it's actually all 3,000 drugs. I just pointed out a few of them at the top, yeah.
And I noticed that the one you first found, sirolimus, is actually number 177.
I thought it was 56, but yes, it was, yes.
But it's lower down the
Very
list.
observant.
So, I mean, lucky that it worked. But how do you think about, getting rid of all the things that may not work? So in other words, there is no negative data put out to be put into your AI model. So how are we going to deal with that problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, so the reason why we do want to go through all 3,000 drugs in every disease, and this is, I guess, one of the things that's, I guess, very novel and innovative about this approach, is that when people do repurposing, usually they just give you the top hits. But I think there's a lot to be learned, to your point, about the negative controls, the things that don't work, and making sure that they get low scores. The algorithm's going to get better at picking high scores if we can pick out the things that are low scoring. So we were really pleased with this first run to look at the things at the top and the things at the bottom. Of course, I just showed a little snapshot today, and we're talking about like in the last couple months that we've been running these. But it's a great point, and I think that there's a lot more that needs to be done to validate and to improve these. In fact, one of the things that we mentioned is working directly with pharmaceutical companies and groups where a drug's now generic, and you can say, these are the 20 indications. We thought about the drug for a long time. You know a lot about that drug. We thought about these indications. We thought about those. We did work that proved this thing worked or didn't. We may not have published it. And work with us directly and help us to understand how could we have predicted that this would not be a good drug versus would actually be a good drug.
Any other questions out there? I have another one for you
Sure.
on that note. Anyone who is a regular reader of STAT and has read Casey Ross's work knows that AI and healthcare can sometimes be an imperfect marriage. How are you integrating humans and checks and balances into things to validate the things that you're finding?
Yeah, great question. So, we use artificial intelligence to start because we need to be able to get from 36 million possibilities down to a manageable number. But that's where we really need humans. Once you get it down to a manageable number, where you can actually dig deeply into the science, you can engage with companies that worked on those drugs, you can validate those hits in the laboratory. The AI scoring is really important as a starting point, but then in my opinion, you really have to have great people, and that's where you also have to put in place, to your point, some decision points around how do you pick a disease to go after. I mean, we're a nonprofit, so we don't have to say, well, we picked this disease because there's some commercial reason. We have the opportunity to go after the disease of the greatest unmet need, and how do you define unmet need? Is it patient suffering? Is it lives? Is it, there's a lot of ways to think about that, and actually, I spoke to Peter Bach about this last night. I'd love to talk to him and others that have ideas for how do you think about, it's a finite set of resources. I wish we had infinite resources for what we're doing, and maybe you guys can help us to get closer to infinite resources, but we have finite resources and we have to make sure we spend every dollar the best way we can.
Mm-hmm.
Isa, we have a question over here.
Hi, thanks. It's Brad Ringeisen from the Innovative Genomics Institute. I actually have two related questions. The first is just plainly mental health. I know that trying to get drugs to cross the blood-brain barrier is difficult, but have you considered mental health and put that into some of your algorithms? And then number two, the related question, I'm from UC Berkeley now, and we've started a Center for Psychedelics. Have you considered control substances and put that into some of your algorithms as well, rather than just looking at those FDA-approved drugs?
So these are great questions. We've just started with the 3,000 FDA-approved drugs. We love that they're FDA-approved and that they're at your neighborhood pharmacy, and if we can figure out new use, we don't have to worry about manufacturing, we don't have to worry about regulatory approvals. It's just a matter of linking these two together. I mean, there's no greater opportunity for return on investment than that. But to your point, there are also opportunities to expand out, to think about potentially controlled substances, but also to think about phase 2 or phase 3 failures. Those are really, really great points. And where we would like to go in the future. I do also want to mention that a couple of the repurposing opportunities that we're most excited about right now, and obviously we have more work before we're ready to move forward to trials. One of them is meroleptin for anorexia. There's some really interesting early data that we're really excited about. And the other one is folinic acid for autism spectrum disorder. Again, in both cases, there's some early clinical data that looks really promising. And these are compounds that probably wouldn't move forward without big push, and so we're excited to potentially push in those areas.
Isa, we have another audience question right over here.
So I know that drugs for people with uteruses tend to be understudied. Is it possible that in going through this AI, you're able to pick out things that might actually help, say, endometriosis or PCOS? Or things like that might affect people?
Absolutely. So, the algorithm is literally all versus all, every drug against every human disease, and looking for the most promising opportunities. And then, of course, then you have to apply filters like, major unmet need, really neglected areas. Because we're a nonprofit, we can go where other people don't want to go, and make sure that we're addressing issues that the system isn't.
David, thank you so much. Thank you all for the great questions.
Thank you.
Isa, we do have one more question here in the back, though.
Oh, sure. Make it a good one.
So I just want to ask for your opinion regarding how you handle misinformation, because over COVID, we saw some repurposing related misinformation, and how do you recommend managing that when you go on this effort?
Oh, it's such a great question. So yeah, and I'll just mention COVID in particular to start. So dexamethasone and tocilizumab are two repurposed drugs for COVID that have literally saved millions of lives. By far the most lives saved from any drug were those two in COVID, and they got like no attention whatsoever. And then we all know that some other drugs got a lot of attention that in most cases didn't end up panning out, but maybe there were some at least mixed results in some cases. So I think that the way we address that through what we're doing with EveryCure is to get beyond just this looks promising, but to actually do the definitive clinical trial and to make sure that we have a gold standard definitive clinical trial that demonstrates the drug actually works in the disease population. And then secondly, to make sure that we work with the patient groups in that disease area to make sure that the patient populations and physicians in that area are aware